Welcome to the Catholic Culture Podcast, dedicated to the Holy Family. I'm Thomas V. Miras. Today I'm speaking with poet and critic Dana Gioia about the state of contemporary Catholic arts and poetry. Today's guest is considered by many to be the greatest American Catholic poet of our time. Dana Gioia was the chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts between 2003 and 2009. He has been the State Poet Laureate of California since 2015. He is the Judge Whitney Professor of Poetry and Public Culture at the University of Southern California. He has authored 5 books of poems as well as 3 books of literary criticism. He's also written a few opera libretti. His most recent volume of poetry is 99 Poems, New and Selected, from Grey Wolf Press. His most recent book of literary criticism was published this year by Wise Blood Books. It is The Catholic Writer Today and Other Essays. The title essay was originally published in First Things in 2013 and set off quite a debate in the Catholic literary world. I'm so happy to be able to present this interview to you in which we discuss the attitude of today's generation of Catholics towards the arts and how it differs from even the attitude that was prevalent perhaps a decade ago, the revival of interest in poetry in American culture as a whole, and some of the reasons why people have found poetry intimidating and the way that reading poems out loud can help us get past that. We discuss some of his own poems and the influence of the Catholic faith on his writing, the value that poets can derive from working with musicians and composers, and the role and obligations of the critic. Dana Gioia, welcome to the Catholic Culture Podcast.
I'm glad to be talking to you.
You know, it's funny. You're not the first Gioia that I ever encountered. When I was in high school, because I was starting to study jazz piano, my oldest brother gave me a copy of The History of Jazz by your brother Ted, who is an outstanding music historian. And then when I was a freshman in college, I read one of your poems in a class and I liked it. But it took me several more years, I think, to realize that you were related.
You know, most people have not figured that out yet. It seems to have amazed people. Gioia is an uncommon name, even in Italian. But I'm glad that you encountered my brother's work. Ted is the smart Gioia.
So I'm wondering if you have the sense that I do, which is whether or not we are on the cusp of a Catholic artistic renaissance, and I have no idea if that's the case. I think maybe not quite yet. But it seems as though Catholics have become more open to the arts in the past decade or so. Maybe it's just that I'm around different Catholics now in New York City than I was as a freshman at Christendom College. But I used to have the impression that the sort of Orthodox Catholic intelligentsia were a little bit suspicious of the arts, or at least anything kind of new. They certainly weren't interested in jazz. They had a blanket condemnation of modern art, which is understandable and true in some cases. And they were hiding in the canon to a certain degree. Now I get much more of an impression that, you know, Catholic writers, Catholics in the Catholic public sphere are much more likely to be interested in jazz or the films of Tarkovsky or things like that. Do you have a sense that anything's changed?
I don't think you're wrong, but what I think you're giving me is a generational view. Let me give you my generational view. I'm 68 years old, and, you know, I began my Catholic education before Vatican II. So I was still raised in the Latin Church. I'm from a working class family from Los Angeles. My mom is Mexican. My dad is Sicilian. And even though, you know, we're in a rough working class neighborhood, growing up being educated as a Catholic, I had this sense that I was part of a continuity in 60s LA. It went all the way back to Christ and Caesar. And so it was a very strong, artistic, intellectual, spiritual formation. By the time I was in high school, Vatican II was happening. And I don't want to say Vatican II was all bad. I certainly don't think it was all good, but it's incontrovertible that there was a huge rupture in the church. We lost our connection with Latin. We lost a lot of our connection with ritual. And in an artistic sense, I saw the church abandon, as it were, a sense of a commitment to beauty and this continuity of the European artistic tradition, which had been nurtured by Catholicism, and an engagement with a kind of, I thought, sort of low-level pop that was largely targeted at sort of social, political objectives, a great watering down. It's not unlike what's happening in other parts of our culture right now. In my generation, most artists and intellectuals that were raised Catholic left the church. I'm an exception, I think, in that. What I see with your generation, how old are you, Thomas?
I'm 29.
29. Okay. I figure you're still in your 20s. You have come into a church in which you felt, I think, now I'm projecting here, and you tell me if I'm wrong, deprived of your connection with the great artistic and even intellectual tradition that the church had fostered over the last 2,000 years. The connection that goes back to Palestrina, to Mozart, to Michelangelo, to Bernini, to the great architects, like Bramante, of the Renaissance. And you're trying, in a sense, to rebuild that connection for your generation, for your church. And I have a lot of optimism about what you're going to be able to do. I think you're still tremendously far from the goal that you're after.
Yeah, well, I would certainly agree with what you just said. My specific upbringing was in a very sort of intellectual, conservative Catholic environment. So there was a sense of connection with the past, but there just was also a lack of interest in, let's say, even the great American art of the 20th century. For example, I was sensitive to the fact as a young man that people were either suspicious of or completely indifferent to jazz. They would sing the praises of Bach and Palestrina, and I don't want to get into the relative merits of these things, but there was no interest in the value that had come out of musical culture in the 20th century. And in other scenarios, reading the letters of Flannery O'Connor, for instance, I could relate to some of the complaints she was making about an overly moralistic approach to art, which sort of treated anything that wasn't confessional, perhaps, or in the canon with suspicion. So that was sort of the attitude that I felt like I was dealing with as a young person.
I mean, it's interesting. Catholics never lost their vital connection with the traditions of philosophy and theology, but they did lose it with art. I tend to look at human knowledge as happening in different languages. You've got the language of science and mathematics, in which you can describe reality, you can alter reality, literally, largely through numbers, by rearranging numbers and ratios and things like this. Then you've got the language of philosophy, of theology, of politics, of law, which is a conceptual language in which things are turned into abstractions. There's another kind of knowledge, which is mystical knowledge, which you and I both believe in, but it's not something that's available to everybody, and it's not a kind of knowledge you can control. But there's a fourth type of knowledge, which I think is the most powerful, the most common, and the most universal. And that I would essentially say the poetic language, the language of beauty, the language of experiential knowledge, stories, songs, images, shapes. And that's something that everyone can understand. Not everyone can understand science. Not everyone can reason particularly well with conceptual language. Very few people are given mystical knowledge, but everyone can react in the fullness of their humanity to a poem, to a story, to a song, to a movie. Catholics lost their connection, as it were, to beauty, to poetic language. And because of that, it's limited our ability to talk to the world. As you know, and the reason you're inviting me to speak today is that I just published a book called The Catholic Writer Today. It begins with an essay called The Catholic Writer Today, not surprisingly, which was published in First Things a few years ago. When that essay was published, it created an explosion of reactions, because even though I was talking about writers, I think many, many Catholics understood that I was talking about how Catholicism had retreated from the world of arts, from the language of arts. And because of that, there was a kind of basic deprivation of not only Catholic experience, but the ability of the church to be heard in the world, to speak effectively to the world. And I think that people will go back and forth on this philosophically, but let me just say something. I know a lot of people who have become Catholics, who are converts. My wife herself is a convert. A few of them converted because of philosophical, theological arguments. Most of them converted because of something that was experiential. They walked into Notre Dame and they experienced something there that all of their logic could not account for. And it's that experience, hearing Mozart, reading Dante, that they began to explore, and the exploration eventually led them into the church. That is what we have lost. Now, that being said, as an artist, I don't believe that the purpose of art is to convert people and bring them into the church. But what I do think is that, and I'll just speak as a poet, what poetry is a kind of human conversation. And if you envelop people in a conversation which considers certain things that perhaps the mass media, the commercial entertainment culture, which just has absorbed everything in the world, not just in the West anymore, but the entire world, conversations that wouldn't be happen in that culture, it's very powerful.
You know, coming at this as a musician, I do believe that the greatest service that art, and especially music, can do for the church today, specifically, even more than conveying Catholic values in some way, is to get them out of their heads. And I feel that we, at least in the environment I grew up in, have a very over-intellectualized version of the faith. And I think you mentioned mystical knowledge. It's true that mystical knowledge and poetic knowledge are not the same thing, but Maritain would say they both proceed by a similar dynamic, which is...
They're both experiential and holistic.
Yes, and they have to do with oneness, where you become one in a way with the thing that's contemplated. So I think that the greatest thing that the arts can do for the church now is to teach people contemplation in an age that is either really in your head or in your flesh. It's like we're either distracted, our entertainment is distracting us and not centering us, or we are totally in our head and out of the senses and the world of reality.
The entertainment culture in which we live largely speaks to the worst part of our humanity. You know, it speaks to our most craven instincts. It speaks to our resentments, our fears, our envies, and it's very powerful. You know, you can speak to the lowest and you can speak to the highest part of you in music or in poetry. But let me say something about poetry and see if you as a musician don't think that this is almost identical to what goes on in music, because poetry and song are the same art. If you go back into ancient culture, everything that they called a poem was either chanted or sung, or quite often chanted, sung, and danced. And song were ways of making art with your human body. In fact, if you go back to Latin, in Latin, the word for song is Carmen, like the woman's name, Carmen. Carmen also means a song. It also means a prophecy. It also means a magic spell. So if you look at this, like, why are they using the same word? Well, it's because the Romans understood the nature of poetry. Poetry is a special way of speaking in which speech becomes elevated to song. It's a special way of speaking that creates a kind of magic spell. Same as music. When people are into music, you'll see their bodies moving in time with the music. Poetry and music both seek to create a kind of mild, hypnotic spell. This allows us to kind of focus on the song, focus on the poem, and relax our defenses so that our memories, our intuition, our emotions come closer to the surface. So it's a special way of speaking that invites and rewards a special way of listening. And it allows a kind of transaction to happen. Now, I think in general what entertainment does is just to try to bring you to predestinations, to places that are easily manipulated. But I think real art opens up something and lets you explore it, creates a relationship with the work, which requires you to work a little harder in terms of perception. So when I see myself as a poet, and I'm happy to say that poetry is now the fastest growing art in the United States. It's not my opinion. It's statistics based on the last NEA National Arts Participation Survey. So there's something happening right now in our culture which is making poetry more rather than less relevant. And I think one of the things is that people are hungry for an experience that isn't dictated by global entertainment corporations, that isn't openly manipulative on their psyches, on their minds. And see, in Catholic iconography, the thing that killed you, you carry proudly. So they chop, your head off with an axe. You have the axe in your hand. If you're St. Bartholomew and they flayed you, you hold the knife which they've flayed you, which is to say the very thing which your enemies thought would destroy and indeed shame you, you hold proudly because to a certain degree, it is the instrument of your redemption, of your sanctification. I don't think I'm stretching the metaphor by saying one of the things that makes poetry popular, one of the things that makes poetry trustworthy is its very unpopularity. Nobody can make money off poetry, which means that even if you're listening to a poem, even if it's a bad poem, there is something authentic about it, something that isn't prefabricated about it. Now, I'm not particularly interested in bad poetry, but I think what it also means is that a real poem people are drawn to because it gives them a kind of transaction which other things in their culture do not readily do. I think you could say the same thing for jazz. The experience of listening to jazz is just fundamentally different than listening to, one of the highly overproduced pop songs, that are being sold today. So what I'm trying to do as a poet is, in a sense, to preserve, to expand, to refine a kind of human capability, not really being nourished elsewhere. That's not an argument that's unlike the argument we make for the church. But I think people come into the church because they feel a hunger which is not being fed elsewhere. So anyway, in writing The Catholic Writer Today, what I tried to articulate, I start off with a kind of historical overview of this transition that's happened in American Catholicism. There are more Catholics in the United States than people of any other faith. If you went back to 1940, 1950, Catholic culture in this country was robust. You couldn't talk about the novel without talking about Catholic novels. You couldn't talk about poetry without talking about Catholic poetry. You couldn't even talk about Hollywood without talking about very powerful Catholic filmmakers. That is almost completely collapsed and vanished. And what we're doing right now, I as an older person, you as a younger person, is trying to rebuild that, which means two things at once. And this is the hard part about it. We're, on a practical level, rebuilding the infrastructure. Where would you get recorded? Where would you get published? Where would you do all these things? You see this happening in Catholic universities. They're trying to rebuild the infrastructure. New colleges are being created to create, truly faithful Catholic educational institutions. So we're trying to do that institutionally. I've helped create a conference. We did the first one at USC, which is now turning into this huge biannual national literary event. The next one will be at BOLA in Chicago in September. Hundreds and hundreds of serious Catholic writers come there, and we're creating a kind of national community. But the other thing we have to do, and this is something that isn't about infrastructure, it isn't practical, it isn't communal, as individual artists, we're trying to create a real language. We're trying to create real art, something that fascinates, that moves, that delights people. And so, it's a double challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting you mentioned things about the musical qualities of poetry. And Poetry has always been the art form that most intimidated me. I would say the two that I know least about, ironically, since you mentioned them, are poetry and dance. But I was never intimidated by dance, just pretty ignorant about it. Haven't seen a lot of live dance. But poetry, I always had this anxiety that, first of all, I don't know if this is good or not. I was reading contemporary, reading Image Journal, and a lot of that is good, but I was never sure. And then secondly, I'm not sure that I understand this, or I feel like I might be missing something, even if I think I might understand it. And I had an experience recently which began to transform my relationship with poetry, which is I discovered this podcast called The Daily Poem, which is run in association with some kind of Christian classical schooling journal. I think it's called Forma. And it's very well curated. They just have a poetry reading every day. So within listening to 2 or 3 of these poems, I found that the experience of having the poem read aloud to me almost completely bypassed those insecurities that I had. It helped that the poetry was very well curated. It was all, really good stuff and classic stuff, although including some contemporary poetry, even some of yours, I believe. But hearing it in its most sort of incarnate form, in its most sensible form, in its most musical form as a musician, that's something I could latch on to, almost made it a moot point whether I understood it. And because it's happening in time, in the moment, I couldn't actually go back and look and second guess my reading. So just in the course of listening to a few poems, I found, wow, I'm not really afraid of poetry anymore.
Well, you've articulated from the viewpoint of a listener what I was talking about historically about the nature of poetry. People who are listening that have trouble with poetry, let me just say a few things. First of all, many of the poems that you read and don't like in very famous places are not actually very good. I would say most of the poetry that's published is not very good. So you may actually know something that the editor didn't. Secondly, that most people don't really like to read poems much, but most people like to hear a good poem read well. Now, for the last 3 years, I have been the Poet Laureate of California. And as part of my laureateship, I did something that no one else had ever tried to do before, is I decided to go to all 58 counties of California. Now, California is a huge piece of real estate. It goes from the Pacific Ocean up into the high Sierras, down to the desert, up into the Pacific Northwest rainforests. And so I went to these places, most of which are, even in California, quite rural, some of which are tiny, isolated towns. Everywhere I went, I got a good audience, and people loved hearing poems. This goes against the accepted wisdom of the academy, which is still living in kind of the aftermath of modernism, where poetry is this elitist language of great difficulty in which you require critics decode. And in fact, one reason that most people, especially in your generation, don't like poems is your experience with poems has largely been in a classroom where you're given a poem and asked to analyze it on the page. So poetry, you begin to approach poetry visually, conceptually, analytically. What you've discovered from these podcasts is that if you once again, you think about the basic human languages, the language of concept, of analysis, of abstraction. That's not what poetry is written for. Poetry is just like music. It's a temporal, musical, auditory art. And there you go through it and you experience it. And in fact, the older I get, the more I respect the fact that I write a poem, I think I know what it means. Somebody else hears it, and they have a very different reaction to it. Both my assumptions and their reactions are genuine, that a poem allows many different sorts of transactions to happen.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I wonder what you would think of the analogy between reading a poem on the page and reading it aloud, or hearing it read aloud, and reading a score and hearing or playing the music. Is that too extreme of a distinction to make?
I mean, I think that's a beautiful extreme comparison, because if I say, man, I love Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, and I hand you the score, unless you're one of, the 1 in a million person who can actually hear the score because of training and natural talent in his or her head, it's not going to mean anything to you. Poetry is not quite that extreme, but it's the same thing, is that until you've had a great deal of literary education, it's very hard, I think, to be able to react to a poem entirely on the page, except as a conceptual document. For thousands of years, poetry was badly taught. They would take people in there and they would recite poems to them, and the kids would memorize poems, and they had recitation contests. And consequently, everybody liked it. About 80 years ago, they found the right way of teaching poetry. And I mean this quite seriously. They found absolutely the right analytical approach to understanding how a poem operates. From that moment on, people hated it. Or rather, the audience fell off because it went from experiential, musical, temporal to sort of analytical, visual, conceptual. And since this is where the action was, wrote more and more poems that responded to that kind of analysis. As a poet, I am one of the central figures of a new movement in American poetry. Not so new because it's about 30 years old now, called, we didn't name ourselves, we were attacked, and they said these new formalists. So the Quakers, the Shakers, those were insults that were hurled at people. But what we tried to do was to bring rhyme, meter, and storytelling back into poetry. And guess what? People like it. Now, the academy, the academics attacked us mercilessly from the beginning. I mean, they're still attacking us. But the fact is that 30 years later now, poets of almost every school are beginning to rhyme again. They're beginning to use meter again. They're beginning to worry about how their poems sound, how they're performed. And consequently, poetry is growing rapidly, especially among your generation. The audience in people from 18 to 35 has doubled in the last 5 years in the United States.
That's fascinating. I did not know that.
So you're kind of part of it because, you heard this podcast and you're responding to it, but that's what measured in these surveys. So anyway, I feel that as a poet, I'm living at a good time because even though I'm doing it rather differently from the academic mainstream, I have an audience. And this is the other thing that your podcast has taught you. In school, they give you they give you a book of poems or whatever. People like poems, I think, most one or two at a time. They like to hear them. They like one or two. They don't want to be overwhelmed. They want to be able to mull them over. And so I do films of poems. I read poems on the radio. People like Garrison Keillor read my poems on the radio. And one has an audience. And I think poetry is great because it's cheap, it's portable, it's invisible in a way. I like the invisibility of a poem that you only hear.
Yeah. You were nice enough to send me your latest volume of poems, 99 poems, new and selected. And I can only say I wish I had more time to read these before the interview because I did not have any question about whether or not they're good. I mean, they're all outstanding. Not only did I enjoy them, but I felt like I sort of understood them. I won't say, anywhere near completely, but I mean, I knew at least one of the things you were saying.
Well, Thomas, the worst thing you could do with my book, 99 Poems, is to read all 99 poems at once. I think, read a couple at a time.
Sure. And there's such a variety. I love that you have these narrative poems in there. That I was like reading like a page turner, I know you're supposed to savor poetry, but the first time through, I read a couple of your scary ones. I read Haunted and I read Counting the Children, both fantastic.
Oh, Counting the Children was turned into a ballet, and Haunted was just turned into a dance opera by the composer Paul Salerni. But Haunted is a ghost story that is wrapped around a love story. But as you follow the story through at the very end, there's an ending you don't expect, and you realize it's actually an altogether different kind of story. In fact, I've never thought of it in this way, but, a critic just wrote about it and called it a conversion narrative. Something that happens that changes a person's destiny, changes their life permanently. But anyway, as a poet, I feel it's a good time to be a poet. And the whole reason I became a poet was that I just loved doing it more than I liked anything else, even music, because I thought originally I was going to be a musician. And I guess you probably see a lot of the musical training in the poems. And it's nice to sort of be able to do something that you love and have other people like it too.
Yeah. One of the videos that you sent me of you reading a poem, reading one of your poems, and one of the poems in this collection is The Road, which is definitely, I don't know if this was intended this way or not, but it's one of the most terrifying poems I've ever read. That's how I read it. I don't know if it's supposed to be read that way, but I read it as terrifying. Like, oh, I don't want this to happen to me. And a number of the poems that you recommended that I read prior to this interview, they seem to share sort of a theme of frustrated desire or just a failure to desire at all. And I suppose it would be something more like the latter in this case. There were a few that struck me, and actually one of them wasn't one of the ones you mentioned. The Road and Nothing is Lost spoke to me very personally as well. But I wonder if you could read us The Road first off.
Yeah, let me read this. Let me say two things to introduce it, though. First of all, it's a sonnet. I don't normally write sonnets, but there was an editor, a guy named Bill Baer, actually, very devout Catholic. He used to run a Catholic writers conference at a convent in New Jersey. But Bill Baer kept wanting to, sonnet. And finally, I was writing a poem, and it was sort of hovering between 13 and 14 lines. And so I decided for him to make it a sonnet. So it's a very unusual sonnet. It doesn't have the normal rhyme scheme. It all rhymes, but rhymes differently than the normal one. But secondly, this last weekend, I taught an all-day seminar for a Catholic reading group in Napa on the Divine Comedy. So we spent the day just going through the opening cantos of the Inferno. And so my poem, The Road, uses one of the oldest symbols in poetry, which is the road as a symbol of the journey of life. The road. He sometimes felt that he had missed his life by being far too busy looking for it. Searching the distance, he often turned to find that he had passed some milestone unaware, and someone else was walking next to him. First friends, then lovers, now children and a wife. They were good company, generous, kind, but equally bewildered to be there. He noticed then that no one chose the way. All seemed to drift by some collective will. The path grew easier with each passing day, since it was worn and mostly sloped downhill. The road ahead seemed hazy in the gloom. Where was it he had meant to go? And with whom?
Yeah. It's so scary.
Well, yeah, I've always resisted the notion of writing an uplifting poem. I mean, my poems are there to make you think about things. And this is a poem about whether you're choosing your own path in life or if you're just following the crowd, taking the most worn whim. And so anyway, I like that poem. It's nice to have a poem only 14 lines long that says something important.
It had a very biblical resonance for me. Not that people don't choose their path exactly, but sometimes they sort of choose not to choose, and in so choosing, they choose or something.
Well, Joshua Wren, the fiction writer who is also the publisher of Wise Blood Books, called me a Christian existentialist. And I never thought of myself in those terms, but I think it's actually quite true. It's about the whole notion of being responsible for defining your own existence, about making the choices which define you. As Kierkegaard says, the existential leap.
Right.
And this poem is a poem about somebody who doesn't want to leap, just wants to stroll along and is kind of too preoccupied by things. I mean, I think that's actually the existential dilemma of the current generation. Your generation, even more than me, is you're just besieged by emails, by tweets, by phone calls, by social media. You've got 1,000 things to do, to listen to watch. And not you, because you're obviously someone who's developed your inner life, but so many people are so busy, they have no time alone. They have no solitude. They have no time to hear themselves think. And I worry about the kind of deprivation of the inner life that happens when you're so distracted by so many things outside of yourself. And the consumer culture is about feeding you with desire and convincing you that if you only have this next new thing, see this next new thing, that your desires will be satisfied. But it's like living off junk food. You eat and eat, you get fatter and fatter, and you aren't nourished.
The Road, which we just heard, is one of 3 poems I'd like to ask you to read, all of which, to me, they sort of have formed a trilogy in my mind, and they all have biblical resonance to me. And one of the other ones, if you wouldn't mind, would be Nothing is Lost, because where The Road provides sort of a warning to me, Nothing is Lost, having read it just this evening, at a time in my life which, like, the poem perfectly resonates with at age 29, where I'm really been reassessing a lot of things about my past and what that bodes for the future and how to start afresh. It is very sobering, but it offers something of a constructive approach. I wonder if you could read that one.
I'd be happy to. I'm glad you like it. This is part of a sequence of poems that I wrote that are unified. But I want to say this, the central image of this poem is just a coin. It's a coin, it's in your pocket. And if you pick a coin up, it has all these Latin or old words, mottos written on it. And the older it is, the more worn it is. And the notion that it could be a quarter in your pocket that was in your pocket 20 years ago. Nothing is lost. Nothing is lost. Nothing is so small that it does not return. Imagine that as a child, on a day like this, you held a newly minted coin and had the choice of spending it in any way you wished. Today, the coin comes back to you, the date rubbed out, the ancient mottos vague, the portrait covered with the dull shellac of anything used up, passed on, disposed of, with something else in view, and always worth a little less each time. Now it returns, and you will think it unimportant, lose it in your pocket change as one more thing that's not worth counting, not worth singling out. That is the mistake you must avoid today. You sent it on a journey to yourself. Now hold it in your hand. Accept it as the little you have earned today, and realize that you must choose again, but over less.
That is an interesting last line. I mean, it could mean less in the sense of you have less to sort of invest or a lesser return, so you had better choose what you can get wisely. But it could imply that there's sort of a limited amount of resources that you've been dealt.
All of your interpretations are right. When a poem creates a story, creates a situation, creates an image, which resonates different meanings. If it was just one meaning, you'd write it as prose. What I'm trying to do is give you that experience, give you that choice, give you whatever coin it is that's come back to you that you have to choose how to use, and have your life interpret the poem.
Right. Well, I mean, the poem is very sober, but it offers hope in the form of reality.
Well, it is. It is. Reality is what it is. And if you try to pretend that reality is something simpler and happier and brighter, it's not commensurate with our lives. Our lives are full of joys. They're full of losses. They're full of challenges. They're full of rewards. And you have to sort of see it all together. And so I think it's important to mix the dark and the light. That's reality. Every day we have night and day.
Right. Yeah. The third poem I'd like the audience to hear sort of offers a bigger picture, a sort of a providential gloss, perhaps, on some of these things, on the frustration being turned into something of value. And that is Prayer at Winter Solstice.
Yeah, this is a poem which is not explicitly Catholic, but I think of it as the most Catholic poem I've ever written. And it's about something that's fundamental to the Catholic experience, which is to embrace sorrow, to embrace our hardships, in the spirit of Christ's passion. and have them strengthen us, ennoble us, find grace in those things. This poem actually is 14 lines long. It isn't a sonnet, but it's a series of beatitudes. Prayer at winter solstice. Blessed is the road that keeps us homeless. Blessed is the mountain that blocks our way. Blessed are hunger and thirst, loneliness, and all forms of desire. Blessed is the labor that exhausts us without end. Blessed are the night and the darkness that blinds us. Blessed is the cold, which teaches us to feel. Blessed are the cat, the child, the cricket, and the crow. Blessed is the hawk, devouring the hare. Blessed are the sinner and saint who redeem each other. Blessed are the dead, calm in their perfection. Blessed is the pain that humbles us. Blessed is the distance that bars our joy. Blessed is this shortest day that makes us long for light. Blessed is the love that in losing we discover.
All right, thank you for reading those. You were just speaking of the content of the Catholic faith in your poetry. On a personal level, how has the life in Christ allowed or changed how you live your vocation as a poet?
I was raised Catholic. I had an intense early formation. In college, amid the whole confusion of Vatican II, I didn't leave the church, but I became much less active. I stopped going to Mass regularly, although I could never pull myself entirely away from the church. I didn't feel, as it were, a community that I belonged to anymore. In my 30s, I'd always read theology. I'd always read Augustine, things like The Imitation of Christ. I began to seriously read the Gospels again, largely through, curiously, a Protestant, Albert Schweitzer. Began reading his books of Christology. And I was now ready, in a sense, to hear the Gospels, to hear what Christ said in a way. And I began, with great difficulty, trying to lead my life in accordance with these sometimes absurd things that Christ says. Love your enemies. And I began to try to deliberately change my behavior, my very complicated literary public life. When I was 37, my first son died suddenly. And my wife and I lost our first and only child at that point. And it put me back into a kind of darkness that I had to reassemble my life. It took me another 10 years, I think, and the birth of 2 more children to be able to put my life back together. But, what I've really tried to do, because I'm a very intellectual person. I love theology. I love philosophy. I love complicated systems. I'm very good at using complicated systems, is to decomplicate myself as a Christian, to try to live very simple things. I've noticed that when Christ speaks to the multitudes, we don't really have that many private conversations with Christ. There's a few in the Gospels, but most of what he's saying in public. He's saying with other people as witnesses. He speaks in stories. He speaks in poems. He speaks in aphorisms. Because what he's telling us is what you need for salvation is found in these very simple things, and in the emulation of his death and sacrifice, which is, what we call the Mass. And I began, in a sense, to become a peasant again. I'm an intellectual, I'm a poet, but I realized that, what I needed to do is to take the simplest, most human part of me and bring that to God. I think of myself as a pew-level Catholic, and everything has sort of come back into harmony. I realize that there's certain things that I do better than other people, and my service to the church, I think, is that as a writer, as an intellectual, but is also somebody who tries to contribute financially, especially to a lot of causes to help the communities. We are at Santa Rosa are very fortunate to have a new order of sisters that was started here 8 years ago. We started off with two sisters who were actually biological sisters, and it's about to welcome the 15th member of its community. It's small, it's vital, it's young, and it's growing. So my wife and I have become very involved in the future of them. I am a fellow at the Dominican School of Philosophy and Theology at Berkeley. A friend of mine, even as we speak, is dying. He's a writer. He's destitute. He was taken in by the Dominican sisters in Hawthorne, New York. They were created by Nathaniel Hawthorne's daughter, and they take in poor people dying of cancer. I've been calling him and talking to him and being a companion to him as he dies. And I find my mother was very poor. My parents were very poor. They were always broke. But my mother used to send money every week to Mother Teresa. And sometimes my mother, would only have a couple dollars left in her checking account. And she told me, she says, I found out that once I started doing math, I never worried about money. And so, it's the same sort of thing. I realize I enjoy giving money away more than I enjoy spending it. I get much more pleasure helping a young sister get her college degree. I've got a 10-year-old car with 120,000 miles on it, and I'm happy with it. I don't need a new car.
So that's a way that the faith has influenced your life.
Yeah, it's got me out of my egotism. And my egotism is huge, Thomas. I mean, it's a continent of egotism. But it's given me a way out of that. It's kept me from saying, I need to keep up with the Joneses or anything else. And it's just, very simple. Christ asks us to love our neighbors, to forgive our enemies, to make a community, to commemorate his sacrifice, to support those in the apostolate, to try to lead good lives, to ask forgiveness for our sins. So I think of myself as a sinner and a pilgrim who has been blessed by the church. It's interesting. There's a critic. I don't want to name her, but she's a very fine literary critic who, in middle age, after all kinds of problems in her life, became a Catholic. And we were talking about it, and I said, well, what's your reaction? And she says, I just couldn't believe that God would have me back. It gave me such joy. And I knew how she felt. There's another writer in L.A., and she was an alcoholic, had a terrible life. I won't give her name, although she's written about this. And it's the same thing for her. It's that you find a home. I had a critic when I brought out Published Catholic Writer Today who accused me of nostalgia. This essay Gioia is full of nostalgia for this lost Catholic culture. And I plead guilty, because what does nostalgia mean? Nostalgia means, etymologically, the pain we feel in longing for home. I think most Catholics have nostalgia, even ones like you who have never been to that old home. We want what God has promised us, which is a community, a home, a place where we can live in this world. We can love, we can worship, we can celebrate, we can console each other. And that's what we're trying to rebuild in culture. So I am full of nostalgia. I'm full of a longing for a home, which I, as an artist, as a Catholic, can share with others. And that's really what I've tried to do in the book Catholic Writer Today. I've tried to talk about the issues, to present the lives of some very important Catholic writers, Gerard Manley Hopkins, a wonderful poet, Elizabeth Jennings, very complicated case, John Donne, talk about things so that another Catholic writer can come, can pick up that book and can feel that somebody else is describing the home which they rightly long for.
Dana, I'm really inspired by what you said about searching for simplicity, because I have come to realize that my intellect has been my greatest liability spiritually, and also in terms of preventing me from pursuing a life as a musician. It's where I feel safe. And that's why what we said at the beginning of the interview about those other forms of knowledge is so important to me. Has this increased simplicity given you any greater freedom in your creative process?
Yes. When I look at my poems, When I published 99 poems, I chose 99 poems out of the many hundreds of poems that I had published. So I had to go back and reread all of my work. When I look at my early work, I see very much the writer that I am today there, but my work has changed primarily in three ways. It's simpler, it's more emotionally direct, and it's more unabashedly musical. Simplicity, emotion, music. And I think that when I served as poet laureate of California, when I talked, to thousands of people, I learned that what people need is a conversation that doesn't exclude them. The trouble with a lot of modern art, certainly modern poetry, was that it created a conversation that deliberately kept people out. And what I've tried to do is to write poetry that's as good as I can possibly make it, but in ways which do not exclude the alert, the curious, the intelligent outsider. And I think that if you need to have a graduate degree in literature to read a poem, chances are there's something wrong with that poem. And even some of the really great modern poets like T.S. Eliot, complicated, difficult poet, but when you hear the poems, you can feel what he is saying.
Yeah, and I feel the same way about Dylan Thomas. I have no idea what he's talking about, but I've always found his poems intensely beautiful on a musical level.
Yeah. My poem, Prayer at Winter Solstice, is a difficult poem because I'm saying something that other people aren't saying. I'm not explaining it. I'm simply giving you images, and I'm linking them clearly to the Beatitudes. And so you have to sort of feel your way into that poem. Why should we consider the cold blessed, being actually aching with cold? Why is that a blessing? Because it teaches us to feel. So anyway, whatever accomplishments I've had in my life, I think my major accomplishment in recent years is to make myself dumber. and nobody will argue that I haven't made myself dumber. But I think I mean that in a good way. That what I've understood is that a poem that doesn't engage an audience is a diminished thing.
I loved what you said. You used the word unabashedly musical. And what strikes me about contemporary music is a total absence of melody, both in academic art music and in even to a large extent in today's jazz and in pop music. And it's often struck me that is the fruit of a lack of willingness to be vulnerable. So I like that you use the word unabashed there, because I think that people are trying, at least in the case of art music, to be hip and to have something that they can be interviewed about. And it's so similar to what you said about your poems.
Yeah, they're trying to please their professor teachers. Now, do you know that I just did a jazz album?
Yes, with Helen Sung, yes.
She asked me to write lyrics for her. And it was interesting because I had to write lyrics to be set to music and to be sung. And I've worked with a lot of composers, but a lot of times they'll just take a poem I've already written, or I write an opera libretto for them where, we work it together. But I've found that as a poet, working with musicians, actually writing things that people sing has changed me as a poet. There's three things that you learn, or you should learn. Some people don't learn them. Is if you're going to be set to music, it has to be simple enough that people can understand it when it's sung. Now, no matter how well it's sung, you're probably not going to catch every word, which also means that a text has to be simple enough where you can miss a word but still get it. Secondly, it has to have a kind of shape so that the composer can sort of give it a shape, but not be so tight that the composer can't get into it. It needs to be short. But the most important thing I learned, and this is hard, this is so weird for a poet to think about this, is that somebody else has got to come on stage and literally be the person who could sing these things, could say these things. And so you've got to literally create something that somebody else can take away and make their own. And that has been extremely good training for me, because in my poems that aren't set to music, I'm doing that for the reader. I want the reader to be able to take this and make the poem his or her own.
It's interesting that you mentioned your collaborations with musicians. This is something I wanted to ask you about. I cannot write lyrics, so I've always thought if I were ever to want to write music that had words, I would need to collaborate with a poet or a lyricist. I have no experience doing that. So it's a fascinating process to hear about. I mean, do you have any advice for a musician who would like to collaborate with a lyricist? Do the words usually come first?
Well, it depends. With Helen's song, we did an album called Sung with Words. It's a pun, SUNG with words. In some cases, I wrote a poem and she set it to music. In some cases, she would play me a riff and I would write words that were in the beat of that riff, and we would come up in a melody like that. In one case, she gave me a sort of half-formed tune, and I wrote to that. As it turned out, she didn't like what I was doing because she says, no, it's not a love poem. It's a poem about being angry. It's about, these. And so we would go back and forth. So you've got to have a lot of give and take. So the answer is, how does a poet work with a musician? Any way that works. Words can come first, tune can come first, or they can come together. And I think that's why singer-songwriters, they can sort of work on both of them at the same time. But it's very hard. Very few people have been able to do both things successfully.
Well, if there's a revival of interest in poetry, then perhaps my chances of being able to find someone to work with when the time comes are looking better.
I would assume that there are some writers in your audience. Let me say this to the writers, the poets who are listening to your podcast. You should search out songwriters and musicians to work with. You will find as a writer, it's a wonderful experience because it takes the solitude of writing poetry or fiction, and you create a kind of partnership that I think in most cases becomes a very intense friendship. It's a pleasure both creatively and personally to do these collaborations.
All right. So hit me up, people. That's great. I hope I get the chance to do a project like that at some point. I wanted to ask you about the role of the critic. Now, as a musician, we don't really have this tradition, which as a man of letters you have, which is where poets often criticize each other's work. And I mean, I use that word in the neutral sense of criticize, not necessarily to say something negative about it, but to evaluate and explain it. And jazz musicians tend to not have the greatest love for critics. One of the problems with criticism that I've seen, theoretically at least, in terms of making negative public criticism of somebody else's work, and why I've been shy about publicly criticizing other musicians, is that if you're making work of art, you're making something new that has to be judged by its own standard because it is a new thing. Not that there are no objective standards, but it is creating its own set of rules to a certain extent. It's hard to see how even another artist, even a master artist, would be qualified to say, perhaps he could say something about what went wrong, but certainly not to say what you should have done, because he's doesn't have your same artistic voice. And most dangerous of all is saying why something happened a certain way. So, for example, you sent me a review that someone had written of your work, very, very positive review, and you said it was your favorite that anybody had written of your poems. But towards the end, the reviewer mentioned that there were signs of overworking in a few of the poems. And I don't mean to single out this critic, but it's a good example of how could that critic possibly know what poems Dana Gioia worked harder on than others, and what moments were more intensely focused on than others. I think this is something C.S. Lewis has touched on too, is that there were times when he had written something, if I'm remembering correctly, it was him, times he had written something and people had said, oh yeah, he's trying way too hard there, or other times where they said, it seems like he just dashed that off in a hurry when in fact he had spent months and months working on a particular line or something like that. So it seems like there's so little that the critic can actually know. So I'm interested whether you think those difficulties are insurmountable when it comes to negative criticism, and also what you think that the role of the critic in literature and in art in general is.
Well, you've asked a bunch of different questions and you've raised a lot of really interesting issues. Let me see if I can bundle a couple of them together in this. Now, let's say that you and I go to the movies together, okay? So you pick what movie we're going to see, Thomas. What you could be. We're going to see the new Spider-Man movie. So we go in there, we see it, and I say, look, we can't talk about it afterwards. You'd say that's ridiculous. Part of the whole experience of hearing music, of going to movies, is you go there, you experience, then you talk about your experience with someone. And in fact, that's one of the reasons I think people really like to go to see plays or movies with another person, maybe a whole group of people, because it gives you the basis of conversation. Certainly right now, on television, if there's a mini series, people watch it because other people are going to be talking about it. That conversation is called criticism, which is to say you have a conversation about a work of art. It can be a very formal conversation that's in an academic journal. It can be a journalistic conversation in a review. It can be an informal conversation with your friends. It can be a conversation in a classroom. The health of the arts in society depends on the vitality and candor and energy of the conversations about them. In the Italian Renaissance, these painters and sculptors were talking about other people, they're criticizing them, they're arguing about them because it was important. The trouble with jazz, the trouble with poetry, or one of the troubles with them, is that we get criticism, but it's a very narrow kind of criticism. You get, the little review that's in the paper, maybe 200 words or whatever. And that's why your podcast is important. That's why I'm talking to you. I'm a very busy person, but I'm talking to you because it's important for Catholic artists to have conversations about what they're experiencing, what they're thinking, because those conversations create a healthier culture. Now, what is good criticism? I think good criticism does three things. It says, what is Thomas trying to do in this piece of music? Okay. Secondly, how well is he doing it? Okay. And the third thing, is it worth doing? How important is it to do this? There's a novel, a very famous novel in French, that you realize the guy wrote the novel without ever using the letter E. It's very hard in French because E is the most common, probably, letter in the language, especially at the endings of words. And so this fellow wrote the novel. He did it pretty well. The question is, how important is it to write a novel not using the letter E? It's more of a joke. It's more of a stunt. And so, anyway, I think, it's just good to sort of critic is doing attentive to the work, trying to figure out what the artist is doing and then responding to that. But I think that we need to foster more intelligent, engaged, critical conversations among Catholics, not just about Catholic art, but about art and entertainment in general, because it helps us clarify our own thoughts and reactions. And it also lets Catholic artists know that people are paying attention to them. I think is nourishing to any kind of artist.
Oh, yeah. I agree with what you said about the importance of the conversation. I guess what gives me pause is the making of negative public judgments. First of all, in terms of whether the critic is qualified to make such judgments, and second of all, in terms of whether it could hurt the person's ability to make a living.
Well, let me tell you this. If everybody's talking about you, to a certain degree, it's almost secondary what they're saying, because people want to know about what people are talking about. That sounds counterintuitive because when you're starting off, you get like one review and it's good or bad or whatever. But the solution is not to say, well, don't give us bad reviews. It's to let's increase the conversation. Let's multiply the conversation. Let's make the conversation more interesting. And then it really doesn't matter to a certain degree whether it's favorable or unfavorable. It's engaged. Like how many people in the course of Bob Dylan's career took a Bob Dylan album and talked about how awful it was. I just can't stand this. Why has Dylan betrayed him? Blah, 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 blah. It's all part of this larger conversation about Dylan, about things like that. So I know what you're saying because it hurts you as a young artist to get a negative review. But the fact is, if you got a lot of reviews and they went from very positive to very negative, it doesn't really matter because people are talking about you. They're paying attention to what you're doing.
I guess I'm looking at it more from the perspective of a critic. Like if I were to comment on somebody's work, what I would be careful about myself, not only as an artist, but as someone who talks about art or writes about it occasionally, sort of like the moral responsibility of the individual critic. And I guess I would feel the need to approach it with a lot of fear and trembling and humility. And I would prefer not to say anything at all rather than say something negative. You know what I mean? I'd rather just highlight what I think is positive and try to understand it, like foster understanding. I think that's good, and have a more general conversation about art. But like, I wouldn't feel comfortable like panning another musician.
Well, that's very practical and very kind, perhaps even very Christian. But the fact is, if you're going to be a real critic, your loyalty is to the art itself and to the audience. And, you hold the artist accountable to the art and to the audience. I try never to be cruel or snide. When I was a younger critic, occasionally I would go after very famous people that way, and I will try not to be negative to writers who are not well known, better not to talk about them. But it's equally bad, I think, to lie, to pretend something better than it is, to give somebody, who's something's not very good and you pretend it is.
Right. That's why I would prefer to remain silent rather than tell a lie,
It's personal kindness, but you have betrayed the art, and you've betrayed the audience. But I think that's why you need a special kind of person to be a critic. But also, I think what we need is a lot of casual criticism. That's not so, analytical or whatever, what have you been listening to? What are you hearing? What do you like? This, that, and the other. And I think that we miss that. That's what a podcast, I think, is pretty good at, actually. There was a review by a British critic named William Oxley, who's been very kind to me. And actually, it doesn't bother me in the least, because I know he's like reading my poems and he's thinking about them and he's reacting to them and he loves this one and this one he doesn't like. And what more can I want? I mean, the person I love most in my life, the people are my two sons and my wife. Do I think everything both my sons do is great? No, even my wife, who is almost perfect, and occasionally she does something I don't really like, and I'm sure I do a lot that we don't like, but it's in the context of love and attention and care and concern, and that's what we bring to the art. We bring love to the art, and that love allows us to express the other emotions.
Not to harp on this too much, but when he said there were signs of overworking, were those poems, and I don't mean this as an aesthetic question, but were those poems ones that you had poured over in particular?
I have some poems that just come almost at once, and I have other poems that go through 100 drafts. I don't think anybody necessarily can tell one from the other. And I also don't think there's any relationship between how much I work on a poem and how good it is. I mean, some of the ones that I work 100 drafts, on that 100 drafts, I got it right. It's interesting. There's one of the first things I did for Helen's song is a poem called Pity the Beautiful. And I just started thinking, personal reasons I just wrote, pity the beautiful, the dolls and the dishes, the babes with big daddies, granting their wishes. Pity the pretty boys, the hunks and Apollos, the golden lads whom success always follows, the hotties, the knockouts, the 10s out of 10, the drop dead gorgeous, the great leading men. And it just sort of came, maybe I changed a word or here or there. And then it had to go somewhere, and I wasn't quite sure where it went. And then suddenly the ending came, because it suddenly, it had to turn. It goes, pity the faded, the bloated, the blousy, the paunchy Adonis, whose luck's gone lousy. Pity the gods, no longer divine. Pity the night, the stars lose their shine. Now, and it kind of happened in these little things. I mean, the first part, then the second part. From the moment, all these musicians started setting it to music, I said, no, this is written for somebody else. But it didn't stop a couple of other people from just doing it. And they would send me like a completed work, And so, it was great. I wish all my poems came that easily. But, the fact is that if I can see something wrong with it, so can the reader. So I try to get it as good as I can possibly make it. Now, sometimes I miss something that they see. But, I like to work something. I like to polish it. My Italian uncles were carpenters and cabinet makers, woodworkers, and they would just work on something. It just shined.
Before we wrap up in a minute here, I'd like to make a final reference to your book of essays, The Catholic Writer Today, and other essays from Wise Blood Books. And in it, you have a number of great essays about Catholic poets of the 20th century. One that struck me in particular was the one about Hopkins, because I didn't know anything about his life. I didn't know that he hadn't published basically any poems during his lifetime, that he was in complete obscurity, that he suffered quite a bit, and it was very inspiring and moving. But the poet I would like to ask you about, if you don't mind just speaking about him a little bit, just giving a quick introduction, is one that you didn't write an essay about, but he comes up in a couple of the interviews. And in this new collection, 99 Poems, you have a translation of one of his works, and that is the Italian modernist Mario Luzi. Now, am I remembering correctly that you said you thought he was the greatest Catholic poet of the 20th century?
There are perhaps other 20th century Catholic poets who I don't know well enough to judge, but Luzi is an unqualified sort of major poet who's deeply in the Catholic tradition. And one of the reasons I translated him is that his work is complicated. And I wanted people in English to have a sense of why he was so good. Maybe I could just end with a couple of lines. I won't even read a full poem of his. He wrote a poem. Let's see if I can find it here. It's called On Approaching 40. It ends up with a kind of Augustinian vision of the city of God and the city of man. He's 40. He's on a trip. He's in a provincial town. He just doesn't know what he's done with his life. And then he thinks about this. And it's just the last 5 lines. Well, he goes, how you learn from love, from father, from son, all these different kinds of love. And then he ends, and having said this, I can start out now, easy in the eternal company of all things living, of all things dead, to disappear in either dust or fire, if any fire endures beyond its flame. And I like that. I like the notion of understanding that, we're alive, but we're in continuity with the dead. We're in time, but we're in continuity within eternity. And that we disappear, he says, at either dust or fire, if any fire lives beyond its flame. So anyway, I think Luzi is a poet of great wisdom, very much like an Italian T.S. Eliot. Thomas, thank you so much for inviting me on the show. I've had a good time. I hope I haven't been too garrulous.
No, this has been great. I'm sorry for keeping you so long, and I'm sorry for all the technical difficulties, but thank you for hanging in there. And I'm glad we got to bring him up, because I know that you think he's very underknown and underappreciated, and he was certainly one of the figures that popped out to me the most from the poetry quoted.
Well, I'll just end on one note. Remember, we are in a universal faith. All humanity has been called to redemption, and the church is international. And so, knowing only what's in English is to know only part of our artistic legacy. Could you understand Catholicism without going to Italy, without going to France, without going beyond St. Patrick's Cathedral? It's American Catholicism is just a little piece of a larger mystery.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dana.
It's been my pleasure. Good luck. What you are doing on this podcast is important. What your listeners are doing by participating in it is important. So God bless.